Good morning. It is a very nice sunny Thursday where we are. Hopefully it's a nice sunny Thursday where you are as well. Thank you for tuning in to our latest webinar. Today we'll be covering the topic of DPIAs and hopefully answering for you the question, are they a sensible way to assess and avoid risk or a bureaucratic waste of time? We will have the chat and questions section live the whole time and a chance to answer the questions there at the end. So please do feel free to pop questions in there throughout, but we will answer them towards the end. We are trying something new today, so bear with us if it doesn't work. We're trying to run a couple of polls during the webinar. So you should see those pop up in the right-hand side of your screen throughout the webinar, and you should also see the results of those come up as well. Just a note for data protection, your results, your submissions will be anonymous, so other people on the webinar won't see what you voted, so don't worry about that. So let's jump straight into it. Robert, could you tell us a bit about what is a DPIA, just to start with?
Okay, so a DPIA, Data Protection Impact Assessment, I can't help but think that it's not exactly the best named thing in the world. At the end of the day, this is a form of risk assessment that is particularly focused on data protection. And it seems to me that a better name for it might have been a data protection risk assessment, but why they've chosen impact assessment, I don't know. But at the end of the day, it's simply, a risk assessment. And obviously there are risk assessments in various aspects of life and organizations, safeguarding, HR in particular uses risk assessments on a very routine basis. And at the end of the day, that's what this is all about. It's simply assessing the risks of what the ICO calls a project or a plan. But it's about when you want to either do something for the first time or change what you're doing, and where that involves the processing of personal data. But what I'd like to also take this opportunity to sort of point out and emphasize, if you like, is that I think that one of the common mistakes that many organizations make is that when they do a risk assessment at all, they consider a risk assessment is a risk to the business, as it were. And whilst that's completely understandable and a very wise thing to do for obvious reasons, as I say, the emphasis of a DPIA is actually to assess the risk to individuals, i.e. those individuals whose data, whose personal information will be processed by the project or plan. And that comes back down to why it's all about data protection. It is, okay, we're going to do X, whatever X is, that is going to involve processing a number of individuals' personal information. What risks is going to be, if any, are going to be caused to those individuals as a result of us doing that? That's not to say you can't, as part of the process, also assess the risk to the organization, but as I say, the primary idea under the GDPR, which is obviously about protecting individuals at the end of the day, is to assess the risk to those individuals concerned. Carrying on slightly from that, a DPIA is sometimes, under the GDPR, is sometimes mandatory, and that is largely where there's a high risk to those individuals. But the number of occasions when that's likely to be the case, certainly for most organizations on a routine basis, is likely to be, I think, few and far between. But the ICO and most other regulators consider it to be best practice to do DPIAs even when it's not mandatory on a voluntary or an optional basis, if you like, as a good idea. Now, I think that's correct. Perhaps we'll come on to later as to, though, how often, when it's not mandatory, that is, how often and in what frequency and what circumstances it is a good idea to actually routinely carry out a DPIA.
Yeah, and I guess that sort of trigger point, that high risk trigger point, is one of the sort of aspects that causes problems here and maybe makes DPIAs seem a little more complex, perhaps, than they are. Unhelpfully, I think the GDPR doesn't define what high risk actually means. It doesn't say sort of once you pass this threshold necessarily processing is high risk. And I think perhaps it's that sort of mandatory high risk threshold. What does that mean? That sort of puts people off or makes doing a DPIA appear more complex. But hopefully we'll sort of come onto that in a bit more detail and simplify that a bit for you.
Yeah. Okay.
So why are DPIAs important? What is actually sort of the point? What will you get out of doing a DPIA? I think first and obviously sort of most important in a way, or the most obvious, is the compliance piece, where we've said that the processing is high risk. It is mandatory to do a DPIA. And the ICO could, in theory, come around and say, have you done DPIAs for these projects? We'd like to see them. So there's that compliance piece, but that's actually quite a small sort of small aspect of this. And there's a lot beyond that that makes doing DPIAs important. So, for example, raising internal awareness of risks and also just data protection in general. Having a good process and awareness of DPIAs, having a system in place where for every new project that involves personal data, your staff, your employees are thinking, do I need to carry out a DPIA? And then if they do, they go through it. It keeps data protection, I think, sort of at the forefront of what the business is doing, keeps employees aware, means that they're thinking about the risks to personal data in a way that maybe they wouldn't normally when they're just carrying out projects in their day job. Also, importantly, assesses the risk to both the individuals involved, so the data subjects, any risks involved to them regarding your processing of their personal data, but also to the organization. You can assess sort of what will the risks be to you as a business by carrying out this project, processing this data in that way, and not just assessing them, but also putting in place mitigations. So identifying those risks, identifying what the steps are to bring those risks essentially to an acceptable level, identifying the steps that you'll take as a business should those issues arise. It's just good business planning to have that all set out in one place in a DPIA as well. And sort of leading on from that, identifies any data protection issues or concerns with doing that processing. So Robert, could you tell us a bit about the key elements of the DPIA process?
Well, I think it's important to emphasize that although, as we've explained, there are occasions when you need to do, you must do, you don't have a choice to do a DPIA, and there are many other occasions when you don't need to do a DPIA. It's a kind of optional best practice type situation. But I think that how you go about carrying out a DPIA is much more uncertain in a way. And what I mean by that is that the GDPR doesn't provide for a DPA to be carried out in any particular way. There is no, if you like, prescribed form for doing so. Now, there is an ICO template, and I'm well aware that, understandably, most organizations simply default to using that template. And I think that, in a way, causes problems, because I think that the ICO template, in my opinion at least, it's not a very user-friendly form. It's a very, what I would call a turgid form. It's not easy to follow, and it makes, if that form is used every time a DPA is carried out, then it is going to, I think, make the whole process quite challenging, or often challenging, and quite tedious, to be honest, in many instances. And I think that comes, that feeds into the very fact that form is used, bearing in mind, as I say, it's not required. It's not, the ICO makes it quite clear on the website, by the way, that it's not required to use this form. But if that form is used, the ICO template is used, and as I say, it makes the process, I think, a lot harder, more time consuming, and in some respects more difficult than it needs to be. And I think that to some extent puts people off doing DPAs in the first place. And even if they start doing it, they get a bit lost, if you like, and they find the whole process a bit unsatisfactory. And I think that then to some extent feeds back down to, if they've gone through that process once, then maybe they don't want to go and do it again. In other words, I think that in many respects, the way of carrying out a DPIA, as I say, using the ICO template, is unhelpful. I'm not going as far as to say that it should never be used. I'm not saying it's useless. In fact, it's in many respects a very good form. But I think, as I say, for the reasons I've set out, it is, I think, a bit excessive for many, many situations. You can use a much simpler process, because coming back to what we said right at the beginning, this is simply about carrying out a risk assessment. And a lot of these risks and a lot of this assessment, in my opinion, with one or two exceptions, will be common sense. You don't need to use the ICO template for a start. It is really a question of look at it as a structured way of addressing and thinking about issues that perhaps wouldn't otherwise be thought about, or perhaps wouldn't be thought about enough. And one aspect of this in particular that strikes me, and I base this largely on our experience, is that one of the key aspects of carrying out any data protection impact assessment is to identify what the organization's lawful basis is for processing the personal data. That's the data that will be processed by the project or plan, as it were. Now, this is, I think, often overlooked completely, and indeed, it's not really intuitive perhaps for most people, other than perhaps for privacy professionals. So they look at things like, it could be, the system could be hacked, or the data could be lost, and more intuitive, shall we say, things like that. But perhaps what they won't think about is, well, we want to do X, Y, and Z with this data. What is our lawful basis, or what lawful basis could we rely on to do that? Because it's absolutely essential from a compliance point of view to have at least one lawful basis. You can have more than one, but you must have one lawful basis, one or more lawful basis to process data in any given scenario. And I think that arguably one of the most important aspects of carrying out a DPIA is to flag that, to force people, if you like, to think about, well, what is our lawful basis for doing this? Otherwise, as I say, that might be completely overlooked, and with the result that possibly there is no lawful basis or no valid lawful basis to process the data, and therefore the whole thing will fall apart, if you see what I mean, at the end of the day. There's more to it than that, but that I think is in many respects the key to this, if you like. As Izzy's already mentioned, ultimately, and this is again, I think, almost common sense, we're talking about a risk assessment, as we said right at the beginning. This is about identifying risks, and that's the process to identify these risks, including, by the way, have we got a lawful basis? And then, having identified those risks, is there any steps, or are there any steps we can or should take to mitigate those risks? Basically, what you're trying to do with a DPIA is to say, right, these either are no risks, or if there are risks, those risks are all ideally at least low, or at best, at highest, as it were, medium. Because if you carry out a DPIA, you conclude that there's any high risks, then that actually is pretty problematical in terms of doing with what you actually want to do in the first place, if you see what I mean. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. And also to sort of come back to that first slide where we mentioned the high risk threshold and the best practice situation. So when these are mandatory or just doing them for best practice, and slightly trying to bring that and link that into the whole ICO template, what format do you do them in? A practical way to look at this would be to have what we have sort of start to suggest is having a separate decision form or checklist that essentially is easy and accessible and sets out questions about the processing, what data is included, and that sort of sets out as the yes/no questions that all employees can just go through very simply, doesn't take long, means they don't have to do necessarily the full form every time, and slightly makes this a bit more sort of practical and pragmatic to sort of carry out that decision-making process in a checklist form. And then at the end of that, it sort of says, yes, you need either, yes, it's sort of mandatory to do a DPIA, or no, it's not, but it would be best practice. And at least then you've recorded that decision about that project. So for each project that involves personal data, you're recording at least the very basics of what's involved in that from a data protection point of view, and the decision whether or not to sort of carry out a DPIA. And that does sort of, we find that does help to at least bring these to employees' attention more and make it a bit more of a baked in process rather than sort of just giving them the ICO template to complete for every project. Makes it a bit easier, I think.
Yeah, and can I pick up on a couple of things there? You've just said employees, completing it. And I think that, again, that's part of the problem that many organizations have. Who does these DPIAs in the first place, as it were, because I think that I think that one of the things we'd like to get across today is not just the process, shall we say, but the whole the whole merits of doing these in the first place, because that's the title of this webinar after all, which we're going to come back to, by the way. It's not as if we've forgotten about. Are DPIAs a sensible way to assess and avoid risk, or a bureaucratic waste of time? And I think that that an awful lot of organisations think they are a bureaucratic waste of time, and I'm not exactly unsympathetic to that, by the way, that point of view. But I think that a large part of that depends on who is doing the DPIA, so who is tasked with doing a DPIA, who's a decision maker in the first place, as he has touched on, and indeed, what are the circumstances when a DPIA is carried out. I mean, I think that we've had a poll on. Several polls have carried out here. Should we go to the one that's about the use of the ICO template first of all? So interesting, 80% of you, or at least 80% of you who've participated in the poll, 83% even, wow, you're using the ICO template. Now that, to me, suggests you either don't appreciate that you don't have to use that, or it means that you're using it because you don't have an alternative available, as it were. And I think that the voting is changing as we're looking at this, which is interesting, but it's still about roughly 3 or 4 people are using the ICO template. And I think that for the reasons we've kind of alluded to, I think that for many scenarios, I'm not saying, as I say, I know I've said this before, I'm not suggesting don't use it at all. I am saying that a lot of this...
yes, no, I think someone's pointed out in the chat, it's flipped the yes and no the other way upside down. So actually, I think it's saying 75% of people are not using the ICO template.
Okay, all right, sorry, that's my mistake. It is very interesting, which presumably means that most people are using their own template. So my apologies for misreading the poll there. What about the next poll? Do you carry out DPIAs routinely for every contract? Now, assuming I'm not misreading this one as well, I think
it's about 50-50.
Well,
now,
it is. It is 50-50 as we're looking at it. So that's very, very interesting. I mean, my own view on this is that, this is where the use of a DPIA can become a bit of a bureaucratic waste of time. Do you need to do a DPIA every time you enter into a new contract? I mean, obviously there will be occasions when that will be the case. It will depend on the contract, but I think that there should be, in my opinion at least, that sort of flexibility rather than a sort of a rule or a policy or whatever saying we do it every time, because I think if that's the case, then there is a risk that it will simply become a bit of a box ticking exercise, because at the end of the day, when you're talking about a contract, that usually means you want to engage with a third party, for them to provide a service to you or you to provide a service to them, as the case may be. And I think that there will be a built-in bias to want to make sure that the answer is, it's okay to proceed, if you see what I mean. So I'm not really a big fan personally. You might get other privacy professionals disagreeing, of course, of simply saying every time we have a contract, then we must do, we choose to do with a DPIA.
We've got the final poll as well, which is interesting, although not very conclusive. Do you find that DPIAs are helpful and to identify unforeseen risks? The majority response there, 63%, is somewhat. We've got 25% saying yes and 13% saying no. So it's interesting, and I wonder, for the people who've said no, if that's in relation to the prescribed format from the ICO, or whether you just find the whole setup not useful at all.
Yes, the whole process. Yeah. Okay, well, maybe we'll see if these poll numbers are changing as we go on. I don't know.
Yeah. I think, and then to sort of summarize and hopefully answer a bit the question that we asked at the start, I think that DPIAs are a sensible way to assess and avoid risks and to sort of identify what those are, put in place any mitigations, identify sort of the way to proceed with the project in the way that is the least sort of the lowest risk to your organization and to your data subjects, be those your customers, your employees, your business contacts. As long as it's not carried out as a box ticking exercise, so slightly linking back to that, do you need to carry out a whole DPIA every time for every project? And when is the right time to carry that out? And as long as possibly it's not always necessarily using the ICO template, the sort of prescribed format that they've set out there, it possibly makes it a lot easier and makes these more valuable.
Yeah. No, I agree. I mean, I think, if we kind of try and answer between us the question, the question that the webinar poses are DPAs a sensible way to assess and avoid risk or a bureaucratic waste of time? And at the risk of almost saying what you've said, my opinion, and it is my opinion, if you like, is that bearing in mind that this is a form of risk assessments, I think it's common sense to say are a good idea, not necessarily for every simple plan or project, call it what you like, but in many instances and possibly most instances. So they are a sensible thing to do. It's a question of how you go about doing them and what is the process involved. As I say, I think at the risk of repeating ourselves, I think that slavishly using the ICO template is unhelpful and does risk turning it into a bit of a painful exercise, and that blends into that therefore it becoming either something that's not done or as I say, a bit of a bureaucratic approach. And if it's being done simply as a box ticking exercise, i.e. there's no real intention of not doing whatever the DPA is being carried out for, the plan or project that's been involved. If you're going to do that anyway, then it clearly becomes a box ticking exercise, and it's a complete and pointless, as far as I'm concerned, a waste of time. Therefore, so that's my opinion anyway. What do you say?
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I think they are valuable, and I think there's a lot of value that they can bring. For example, just setting out what you're doing in terms of, at a very basic level, in terms of processing personal data for projects that you're carrying out. But I agree. I think that a sort of pragmatic approach needs to be taken in a way that doesn't sort of bog down and put too much sort of bureaucracy on the process of people sort of just trying to do their day job and implement a new system. That's where I think it gets challenging. So I think we can turn to this chat and see if there are any questions in there. Please do put any questions that you have got. I'll have a look through and see if we've had any questions through during the webinar. It's nice to see someone, a couple of people saying they agree that the ICO form is not the best, not the most efficient.
Well, while we're waiting to see if we've got I think 7 minutes or so to go. While we're waiting to see if any questions do come through. I mean, in your experience, when we're both acting as DPOs for clients, when we're getting clients complete DPIAs themselves. Well, actually, two questions really. One is, do you find that in most instances, organizations complete the DPIA and then only involve you at the end to basically send it to you for approval, or do they involve you, as part of the process, as it were, to help you complete the DPIA in the first place?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and I think it definitely varies from organization to organization. But I would think that on the whole, it's mostly receiving the DPIA as a completed product to review, sort of review and approve.
Okay.
Which I think is definitely one way to do it. And I think that's probably encouraged, to be honest, by the ICO template, which just has a box for DPO approval at the end. So someone sort of completed that, got to that point and think, I need to send this to the DPO. But possibly a better way to do it, to look at it, would be bringing in whoever your data protection team is sort of at the start. because you may then find you save a lot of time. They may say, don't use that template. Let's just assess this risk this way or something like that.
Well, yeah, or they may just be able to contribute, especially in terms of, as we were saying earlier, with the lawful basis. But I suspect it largely depends on who is doing the DPA in the first place, which you've touched on briefly, and do they even realise that they can, bring in the DPO at an earlier stage rather than at the very end, as it were. And also, can I ask then, when you're presented, as it were, with a completed DPO, and I don't, I'm not really expecting you to have got a record of this, but just generally speaking, is your reaction that you often would simply look at it, be happy with it and approve it and sign it off, or do you often feel there is a need to go back to whoever's completed it and say, well, what about this, what about that, and challenge, if you like, some of the content of it?
Yeah, I would say sort of maybe 8 times out of 10, there are sort of queries that
Really?
I've got to sort of go back on.
Okay.
And just to sort of quickly point that out, because there are a couple of questions that people have submitted now, I think the main point there that I normally find to go back on is the piece around lawful basis, which you touched on earlier, and sort of just querying why they've selected which lawful basis they've selected, which is quite commonly consent, and just sort of querying how they've come to that decision and why they've chosen that one. I think is probably what I'd usually go back on. But we've had a question: is there a better DPIA template?
Well, I mean, as we say, there is no prescribed form, and we have created one ourselves. So there is a template that we would provide to our clients. But, I would imagine there are, X number of templates out there, as it were. I mean, I would, and this is my approach, and you might not get it, from everyone, but I always think it's best to keep it simple, if you like. So, and I think that, I think I might have said this already, for the vast number of instances that the ICO template is too complicated and too involved, if you like. So is there a better template? Yes, there are. In my view, it's quite easy, in my opinion, to get a better DPI template than the ICO one. Are there any other questions, Izzy?
Yes, we've got, I think probably we can lead on from that previous question of how can you make a DPIA a small component of project risk? So sort of reducing that bureaucratic hurdle, I think, when you're looking at a project. And I think that does essentially link to the template that you use, and possibly the process that you have internally for carrying out a DPIA. Do you make it easy for the person who's assessing that project to carry out the DPIA?
Yeah, I think those, I think you're right. I think those are very closely interlinked together. I mean, just very quickly, I'm conscious that we're nearly out of time here, but I mean, I do, this sticks in my mind that I was having, this goes back a little while now, but I was having a conversation with a representative of one of our client organizations. And I remember saying to him, I think you should do a DPIA for this. And he said, I haven't got the time to do that. And that sort of struck me as a very odd response, if you like. It made more sense to me to have said, well, there's no need to do a DPA. But his response was effectively, I think you're right, it would be a good idea, but I don't have time to do it. And I said to him, well, how long will it take you to do it then? I know to some extent these are a piece of string questions, but I was pretty staggered by his answer. And his answer was 2 days. 2 days. So he was expecting to spend 2 full working days just to do a DPIA. Now, on this particular matter, it wasn't straightforward, but 2 days? I don't think so.
And speaking of sort of being out of time for DPIAs, I think we're out of time today. So thank you so much, everyone that's tuned in and listened. I really hope that was helpful. You should be sent a recording of the webinar to sort of forward on internally as well to anyone that you think this would benefit. Thank you so much for your time.
Bye-bye.